All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the next session of the On Violence Experimental Study session. Super excited to have a new old friend of mine here, Professor Joshua Bennett, based at MIT. I was telling a story to the graduate students here how we met probably about 5 years ago, and we hung out on a bus and we bonded, and it's never been the same. So I was bragging on you a little bit of a flex. In terms of how I met you. So I just feel real deep affection for you right away. So we spent an hour and a half talking before this meeting about Joshua's book, Being Property Once Myself. This study sequence is led by the graduate students of Media Cultural Studies 201. It's a graduate seminar on racial colonial violence. And we had 3 co-facilitators today. We had Courtney Lamb, we had Mallory Peterson, we had Amy Gong. So I'm gonna kind of have them lead the facilitation of the discussion. This is being recorded for folks that are here. Folks that are here in attendance as guests, attendees, folks who are not in the graduate seminar, please feel free to utilize the chat as much as you want. I try to privilege the discussion questions toward the graduate students that are in the class, but we always make time either at the end of the session, or sometimes in the middle of it if folks that are here want to just interject questions and comments, and then I'll invite you to come on live to ask them if you're willing, and if not, we can just read those questions and so forth out loud from the chat. So introduce myself. I'm, for folks that are maybe watching the recording, I'm Dylan Rodríguez. I'm professor in the Department of Black Study and Department of Media Cultural Studies at Riverside, UC Riverside, my employer, and I'm very proudly the kind of curator and organizer of the On Violence Study sequence, and we're welcoming Professor Joshua Bennett today. So with that, I will pass it immediately to Amy, who's going to start us off. And as the MCS 201 students, as you all interject and ask your questions, I'll just have you all introduce yourself in whatever way you like, so we can just kind of economize our time with Joshua. And Joshua, just a heads up, we're going to try to do some shares with you in terms of a couple images that we wanted to think about with you, and then Mallory was actually at some point, probably within the next 30 minutes or so, wanted to share a clip of, and she's going to contextualize it as well, a clip of this dance piece that I think is really interesting in dialogue with your book. So we'll go from there. So Amy, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Hi, I'm Amy. I'm a second year PhD student in the English department. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk with us. My question has to do more with getting your thoughts, more so than a question, I guess. While I was reading your book, I couldn't help but notice that there's some overlap between the Black experience that you outline and just more generally the experience of people of color. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how your work could be applied, the idea of like unwanted and not belonging, to studies about people of color or Asian Americans specifically.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And thank you as well, Dylan, for that beautiful intro. I remember that bus ride very well during the summer from a certain part of New Hampshire to Boston. And it's a glad time whenever we're back in conversation. I always try to write, I think, toward a certain kind of universal impulse, like the materials I'm working with are the materials of the Black expressive tradition. But before I was a professor, even a graduate student, I was a poet who was trying to read from any tradition I could get my hands on to express something deeper, truer, and more metaphysically radiant than anything I was getting in the classroom, to be frank. And so for me, when I came out with this first book, which was based on my dissertation, really what I was trying to do was put together those materials in a way that could be accessible to anyone. I think it's another reason that poetry kind of sneaks its way into the book. At the time that I was at Princeton, the idea that I was being kind of pushed by my advisors was that poetry was a distraction, and that I really needed to be in the library for 12 hours a day with the great novels of the English speaking world. And that's what, would make me a serious literary scholar. And I think instead what ended up happening was I turned to the poetry of people like Tara Betts and Major Jackson and Thylias Moss and Lucille Clifton. And that kind of deeper experience of poetry that I'd gotten, not just from poetry slams and kind of spoken word venues, but from my grandmother's living room in the South Bronx, I think those came to infuse the work. And they brought me back to a New York City landscape that was incredibly diverse. There were folks from across the sort of Latin American and Asian diaspora, the African diaspora, that helped raise me and helped me understand Blackness as something that, to use Gwendolyn Brooks' language, has geographic power. There are Black people everywhere, right, on Earth. Blackness is something that crosses diasporas quite literally. And so, yeah, I mean, that was always the spirit of the book, like it's Black writers that I'm calling upon. It's a kind of Black vantage point that I'm drawing upon whenever my own biography enters the book. But the tools, the instruments, I mean, the instruments are for everybody in whatever freedom struggle you might be engaged in. The next few answers will be more concise. You have to pardon me. I
No,
had
no,
only
no.
slept
Hey, we're here.
3
We're here.
weeks.
You don't have to
Okay.
at all. We're here to just hear you, to listen to you, to study with you. And before I kick it over to Courtney, let me ask you something about this, because I know I was telling folks that you and I had a dialogue about your book right when it came out, as part of that sequence at Berkeley. And I don't remember if I was able to ask you this then. But I want to kind of ask you to linger on the last part of what you just talked about, both the first and last part of what you talked about, in terms of thinking about how poetry and poetics becomes part of your reading method.
Sure.
And I was sharing with folks how I'm so burned out by doing close readings and reading close readings. All right. So like I was just sharing that with people. And then I read your book.
Mm-hmm.
And it fucked with me in a good way, because number one, it offered me another kind of approach to close reading in which poetics was constitutive of the explication. I don't know I hope that makes some kind of sense. I know it does to you. I hope it does to folks that are listening to me talk, but the way that poetry and poetics is actually part of the explication, right? How it becomes part of the close reading method. And it's like the way you framed it is so important, I think, for the grad students who are here, because it's almost like this guilty presence for the poet, right? Like you're being disciplined away from it by certain forces within these fields. But the book completely destroys that disciplinarity in I think a productive way. Could you talk a little bit more about that, for the folks here who are thinking and writing in either similar ways or parallel ways or analogous ways about how to think methodologically against disciplinary and also with a certain kind of aesthetic practice, a poetic practice, etc. Could you say more?
Sure. I mean, I've talked a little bit about this already, but I mean, prose, it was just the dominant structure of my education, right? So I think I've always felt more disciplined in prose than I do with the wild lines of poetry and poetics. It's also worth saying that the poetry of my childhood and even my kind of adulthood, it was always oral poetry. It was poetry that had to land on the ear beautifully. It had to sound beautifully once you gave it away to an audience of people. And I think that very much shaped how I approached the book. You're right. Poetry kind of haunts the book, at least the first 4 chapters, right? And then that 5th chapter, when I get to Tolson, when I'm talking about Hayden, and when I'm thinking about, the brilliant contemporary poet, Zan Phillips, that didn't even come till grad school was over, right? I mean, that was quite literally a chapter I added when I was a postdoc, because I was outside of the structures of a graduate program in English and finally felt the freedom to say, okay, let's get off land altogether, right? Let's go underwater and let's have a whole chapter that's devoted to poetry. Something else that's important on this front is that chapter is largely indebted to my cousin, let's call him James, who served over 20 years in a maximum security prison and took a class with Marcus Rediker and told me about how incredible this class was. They're reading about pirates, they're reading about life on the ocean, and it just got me thinking, like, oh yeah, we need some water in this book. We need something that flows a bit differently so we can get away from what Rediker calls a certain kind of terra-centrist emphasis, not just in history, but in literary studies, right? This idea that anything that happens that's worth noting, anything worth studying or reading closely, it all happens on land. And I realized, actually, there's no real way to kind of dismount from this book without going underwater into the blackness under the sea. And the colors that persist there, ostensibly for no evolutionary reason, right? Like there's great abundance where we imagine absence. And that's the real spirit of the book. And that's something I get from poets. Right? If you talk to, great poets, you talk to poets who just started, a lot of the students I teach, they're 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, man. And you talk to them about where a poem comes from and they'll tell you, I don't know, right? If I tell them, write as if you're a rain cloud for 7 minutes, almost all of them can do it, but they don't know where that stuff comes from, right? And I love that idea, in part because it runs so counter to the disciplinary modes many of us are trained into, where actually what you're being taught is just how to be alone. right? How to stand up on stage and sound brilliant for 40 minutes away from your community, the people you love. It's a kind of atomization, right? That wears the persona of pedagogy, sometimes even a radical pedagogy, right? That's still training you away from that wild sociality of the flock, of the horde, and of the group of poets, you know, who are wrestling against time in order to get a message of witness out to the world. So I think I was trying to just carry that with me, man, in the writing of the book, not just at the level of the prose, but whenever I felt the prose fall slack, I would turn back to poetry. I would say, oh yeah, there's a kind of electricity that's lacking here. I need to go back to listening to poetry, to reading it, or else I'm going to lose the thread. If it's not, if it doesn't swing, I just stop seeing the point at it, you know, about halfway through the program. As if I'm just going to lose my voice doing this, then I need to do something else. I just need to, you know, we opened with the bus. I was like, I need to get back on the tour bus, man. If all that's going to happen in grad school is I'm going to forget how to write and forget how to, you know, write something that sings and swings, then that's not the sort of ethical choice I want to make in this moment in my life. So the book very much carries the remnants of both that anxiety and that kind of quiet promise I made to myself as a younger person.
I appreciate what you're saying so much, and I think that the sing and the swing that you just talked about, to me, that's part of the it's not part of it. I think it's central. It's the spine of the long overlapping complex genealogies of Black study.
Yes.
You know, and I think that there's something interesting and important about how you frame the first part of your response with this notion of being by oneself, but you're saying it in a way that's so anti-neoliberal, right? I mean, there's something about that that's really important to think about in the context of the genealogy of Black study, that pushes back against the neoliberal notions of, especially in academic notions, academic neoliberal notions of being by oneself, you know, the kind of that sense of an intellectual or academic carceral in which you just ponder and think, and it's so contrary to that in a insurgent way.
Thank you, Dylan.
Yeah,
I mean, and I don't want to take up too much time on this, but this is something I've been thinking about for a minute, you know? Like, we just passed the 50th anniversary of Black Studies about 5 years ago now, right? But I also want to think together about not just 1968, but 1967, and y'all are in Cali, right? We're on the campus of San Francisco State University. Amiri Baraka, right, and Sonia Sanchez are there. So there's a way in which there are these poets kind of trying to lay the seeds for Black studies in that environment before we ever get, you know, the discipline or the meta discipline as such, before we get the institutionalization of Black studies. Something else on that front, and this is a fairly common point, right? But at its origin point, even institutionalized Black studies is for everybody, right? It's not just for academicians. It's for the firefighters and the nurses, the mathematicians. Everybody's supposed to take it because it's supposed to be a kind of consciousness raising endeavor. So what Winter says, right? And I know you love Winter too. It's like she says Black studies was a war. It was a war against consciousness, against your own consciousness. It was a way to change what Ellison and others call our inner eyes, right? Now, those are the stakes of Black study. That's a big deal, right? Those aren't necessarily the kind of the methods that we're trafficking in some of these other disciplines, to the point that I think it's actually hard to explain sometimes to people what we're up to, depending on who trains you, right? Coming from a place, you know, like Cornell, like Penn, like Temple. I mean, these places are offering you very different methodologies for reading not just the word, but the world. And I think that's the kind of sensibility I also was really after in the book, right? Because it was these moments were taking place off to the side quite often, not always in classrooms, but in independent studies, in conversations, on buses, on the road, at open mics, where people were saying things they felt like they couldn't say in the classroom space. And that really became the kind of foundational elements of the book. Like that's where it really came from, the whisperings, right? The softer gestures, not necessarily, this is how you formally put together a presentation and this is what your first book should look like in your dissertation. It was actually something a bit wilder than that. And but it felt very much like the spirit of the thing we've gathered here to do, you know, the name of Black Studies or Black Study.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I know that there's folks that are in attendance beyond the seminar that are thinking through this all the time together with us. Courtney, I want to kick it over to you. So Courtney, you should talk about your PhD research as well to kind of frame your engagement with Joshua's book, because I think that's critical here.
Yes, absolutely. Hello. I'm a first-year PhD student in the history department, and I'm studying the history of zoos in the American West and other human-animal coexistence spaces, and by that, all of them are, but set-aside spaces, and how those are performance spaces for interspecies issues, but also very much so for human to human, underneath the human-to-human issues. So your book was really valuable to me and to my research and to thinking through and trying to push the boundaries of how I'm thinking through these ideas. So at the beginning of your book, the part where you're talking about Frederick Douglass and the horse, you say how the enslaved Black person and the non-human animal have the shared experience of opacity, mistaken for emptiness, and a perceived lack of a narrative of origin. And this has come up with another class that I have where I'm an oral history class where I'm trying to think, is it possible to have oral histories of animals, right? Is there a way to work through their behavior, their smells, their sensory world to get to within their worlds? And that applies also to what the shark, as you were saying, like busting out the idea of terracentrism and the way that we have our positionality in the world. So of course, the problem here is anthropomorphism, and which I think can be seen as a kind of enforced servility. And you talk about the dog and how there's a praise for the dog from some animal studies writers about the servility of dogs, that is what makes them successful, because they choose to be companion animals. And of course, captive animals don't choose to be anything, but they are also tranquilized and praised for their getting along with being in captivity. And that is how they earn their right to continue as a species. I think there's a real framework of that being set up. So my question is about anthropomorphism and avoiding it. Do you think there are effective ways to do that? Since I do believe when we are talking about captive animals, we are talking about othered people as well, and overseas places and colonized spaces.
Sure. Man, that's a fantastic layered question. I don't know if you can get beyond it, but I know we can try. Right. And I think, Fred Moten and others really help with this way. He talks about escape, not to paraphrase, not as a accomplishment, but as an activity, right? You don't ever get escaped. And I think about anthropomorphism that way, right? Like it's not an accomplishment. It's like, oh, I have transcended my anthropomorphic lens. I am one with the animal. I think that's when you get in really dangerous space, right? When you believe that you're at one with the grizzlies or something. It's very dangerous. You don't know a grizzly bear. You should stay away. And I knew that before grad school, right? I was like, oh no, I don't know anything about these cats, right? But that's really important. It's also the Wittgensteinian point, right? If a lion could speak, we wouldn't be able to understand it, right? Because we don't speak lion. I think that sort of sensibility, not just of understanding opacity, but a kind of humility in an etymological sense, right? Humility from humos, right? The dust, the dirt. Same root for a human and humor, right? So I think really part of what the animals demand from us is a certain level of humility, right? To understand that opacity is also an opportunity. It's okay that we don't speak lion. And also us not being able to necessarily trace the interior worlds of lions is not a reason to keep them captive. It's really part of why I started with Douglass. What he's articulating, I think, in those public speeches towards the end of the 19th century is the idea that enslaved people actually had a kind of higher moral responsibility to non-human animals, precisely because they had lived and worked alongside them. And they knew that they had this kind of complex, opaque interior world that we could guess at, right? But us not being able to understand it didn't mean that dominion was all right, or that it was justified by a scriptural text or otherwise, right? I think that's such a unique insight, and not one that people often associate with Douglass, right? I think, at least in my education, he was associated with a certain kind of triumphalist humanism, right? The triumph of the one great man through very eloquent English, so eloquent people in the audience would ask for money back because they, quote, came to see a slave. That sort of thing. And instead, when I was, spending time with Douglass, what I found instead was someone who had this deep openness to the non-human or more than human world. And again, in that regard, a kind of deep humility, right? Language is one way to know the world. There are certainly others, okay? And I think when we can really embrace that, we recognize, I love what you said about a kind of oral history from the perspective of animals, but there are countless other frames, right? Like, what are the poetics of animal life, right? What kind of voices do animals have? This is something I've been wrestling with. I'm writing a public policy paper on AI right now, and I've really been trying to wrestle with this question of who or what has a voice as such. What do we mean by voice exactly, right? We recognize that animals make maybe a distinct range of sounds, but like if you've ever had a really intimate relationship with any sort of animals, domesticated or otherwise, you do recognize a certain kind of voice, right? A way that they sound, a certain kind of familiarity that's auditory in nature. And so I wrestle with it. I try to be active about it, about getting outside of at least a certain kind of anthropomorphic gaze that would demand that an animal reflect myself back to me, right? I mean, it's a kind of deep-seated narcissism that I think we all wrestle with. Sometimes, it's not even evil at a conscious level. It can be a desire for relation, right? You can be anthropomorphic because you really want to be close with this tiger. But John Berger, he gets us out of that, right? I mean, that story tells about a woman whose one sort of charity wish is to cuddle a lion. And you know what happens at the end of that story. I mean, it's tragic, right? It's very sad, but it also speaks to something, right? This one wish. She wanted to be close to this kind of grand animal, but clearly her vision of it had been entirely blurred by an entire symbolic regime that she'd grown up in, right? So that story, I think, does work for us on a couple of different levels. And Berger has a few others, right, in that essay on why look at animals. Mm-hmm. And so it's something that was immensely influential on me about a decade ago when I said, all right, yeah, so this is a way to retrain, again, as Winter says, my inner eyes. It's a way to retrain my looking. And that's part of how we get there,
You're making, let me ask you something else, and then I want to flow actually into sharing an image or a set of images that Courtney was talking through before we started this session,
sure.
That you got me thinking about, well, earlier when I first read your book, but just now in the dialogue between you and Courtney, which is thinking about, the Sylvia Wynter's, the way we move from Sylvia Wynter's devastating critique of the humanist civilizational project toward a notion that I think meshes with the idea of trying to push back against, to get into an insurrectory position in relation to anthropomorphism, but which is actually just about the abolition of man in Winter's sense of man, and how the book pushes us to think about how that aspiration, that abolitionist aspiration, the abolition of man, might reside, as I think you're putting it, in an abolition of mastery, an abolition of domination and dominion, in an abolition that of the things that originate in the ontology of man, which I think all of the different humans on this planet are differently allowed access to inheriting. So can you just think with us about this abolitionist possibility or experiment with alongside the other forms of abolition that people have been talking about recently? And I say this, I'll be fully transparent. I say this having developed a really deep skepticism about the ways that abolition, the concepts and notions of abolition have circulated since the summer of uprisings in 2020, but even before that, right? So I think that there's a lot of gems that your book and your thinking is offering to help kind of correct or at least intervene on some of the man-centered notions of abolition praxis that have started popping off in the last 3 to 5 to 15 years, for that matter.
Yeah. Well, no, I appreciate that a lot. I mean, so at least part of what I try to outline in the book, right, is a world without cages or chains, right? I say that's what Douglas is after, right? It's explicitly not only human-centered, right? The idea is that these forms of captivity are fundamentally unethical. So yeah, it's like no prisons, no zoos, right? These are various kind of carceral apparatuses that are expressions of a larger ideology of dominion and domination that is earth killing, right? And for Douglas too, it's important to mention this has a certain kind of metaphysical and spiritual component to it, right? That this does evil against realms that are not even visible to us to behave this way. And this is not our collective inheritance as human beings. This is not our story and doesn't have to be, which for me, and I should mention too, I mean, I taught in prisons first, before I taught in the university. So I think that also changed a little bit about how I understood, one, the stakes and aims of teaching in a classroom as such. It also, I think, really framed the way I thought about abolition when I was 20 years old. Because if you listen, I think, especially to incarcerated and formerly incarcerated abolitionists, they have much more nuanced views. And I mean, it's being recorded, but it's fine. Like, they have much more nuanced views about what might constitute prison abolition than some people I've met, especially since the summer of 2020. Like, they just have a kind of rich and robust understanding of violence and institutionalization, and actually what a kind of abolitionist future could look like, especially one that is necessarily progressive in the way it's imagined. And that, I don't know, I mean, that's really shaped the way I've tried to proceed, not just in my teaching, but in my publishing, and the way I understand what prisons do, which is, of course, cage human beings, right? But also cage ideas and keep the flow of information at the slowest pace possible. Working with incarcerated writers, I think, has also taught me this. Like, you can't send someone's book back to them physically quite often that you edited. And so you have to find other ways, sometimes through JPay, right? So you have kind of capital extracted there. But also you have to, and this is, I think, useful for us, you have to create forms of community, right? To share that material back and forth. And so part of what I've been thinking about in terms of abolitionist praxis is that even some of the vilest aspects of the carceral state are nonetheless instructive. They're showing us what kind of world we'll have to build after abolition, which is one in which the kind of neoliberal atomization we're talking about, the reduction to the individual, we'll have to realize that it's anti-life, right? To get a manuscript back to this young brother I was working with, it takes 2 or 3 people. It takes a circuit that we had to create, sometimes on the fly. It wasn't even always the same 2 or 3 people involved in that process, but it was exceedingly useful because I thought, oh yeah, this is actually what it means to do maybe a certain vision of abolition in real time, right? It's the creation and recreation of one, interpretive communities, to use Stanley Fish's term, but also communities of sharing. We're going to need a different kind of mode of sharing, which I think the book is also about. It's how to share across species and across time. Like Zora Neale Hurston, I think Robert Hayden, these people are after a kind of cosmic thing. And I think it's part of why animals appear the way they do in their writing, right? As messengers, as promises, as witnesses, that also cry out at the violation of the carceral practices of human beings, right? They know our evil. One more quick thing on this. I just did a unit on dogs for this nature poetry workshop I teach at MIT. And some of my students, they were astonished by these kind of, again, circuits of capital. So you have these dogs, right, who are like sent abroad to be used in wars, right? The dogs come back with PTSD. Those dogs are then trained by incarcerated people, right, to help heal them effectively. And then those dogs are sold, sometimes at 5 figures, as therapy dogs, right? So we have these kind of circuits of state violence, right, that ultimately end in turning the dogs into a new kind of commodity, right, at the end of that process, with no thought necessarily for the communities of care that are created on the inside, right? For these folks who are tasked with helping heal these dogs and healing themselves maybe in the process. But I think about that sort of work a lot. Like, yeah, the work of abolition is also it's of reimagining a social world with no need for that kind of thing, right? Where we can imagine other forms of care and community. So, I mean, I think therapy dogs are cool, right? I think we need other kind of methods of getting them there, right? So that's been on my mind a great deal as well.
Let me share something with you, with all of you, actually, not just with Joshua. But you got me thinking, Joshua. I have this real privilege recently, the last year and a half, in which I've been able to develop an emerging, I think, affinity and intellectual and personal intimacy with Mumia Abu-Jamal. Okay, so Mumia Abu-Jamal is now doing his PhD through the History of Consciousness program at University of California, Santa Cruz. You didn't know that, huh?
No.
Yeah. So, yeah, without going into all the kind of idiosyncrasies of how this possibility was constructed. So on the one hand, there's this kind of celebratory moment within the university that we can have incarcerated people doing their PhDs, and Mumia in particular, right? Who the state and the cops have tried to kill over and over again, right? Both officially and illicitly. They've tried to destroy his being over and over again. All right. So there's a celebratory moment, which so when I say that, I'm not being facetious or sarcastic. I'm saying it is something to be celebrated in a certain kind of way, you know, because for me, largely because it means that there's a kind of protective measure potentially around Mumia, where I think it's going to be harder for them to do this to him. Okay, for them, meaning the state and agents and actors of the state to like try to undermine his existence. Having said that, and having met with Mumia in person and being part of his PhD committee and all this kind of stuff, right? The thing that I'm constantly reminded of in the conversations with him, and I don't think he would mind my talking about this, is that alongside that celebration, there's also this I think abrupt and irreconcilable recognition that Mumia Abu-Jamal inhabits this site of, to use your terms, to use Sylvia Winter's terms and other terms, this site of speciation. It's a Fanonian term in my mind, right? That he, and the reason I think about that is that he's constantly reflecting back, and we are trying to mutually struggle with his epistemic and intellectual isolation. So, like, in other words, alongside the fact that he's this prolific writer and a prolific thinker, and he was on public radio for a long time and all that stuff, so people don't think about him as being isolated in the same kind of way, because he's not just any old person held captive, right? He's Mumia Abu-Jamal, like he's got this public presence. Nonetheless, in kind of attempting to generate an intellectual dialogue with Mumia, it's like we're constantly reflecting back to each other how he's not accustomed to it. Right? Like he's not accustomed to it. He's not accustomed to being in a kind of intense and sustained exchange because he's being held captive. Right? He's being held under conditions in which that is basically it's not possible. So then we have these moments of it, like when I visited him last October, where we were able to do it, and I could tell that it was like exercising you know, neurons and synapses and muscles that were atrophied, that were intentionally atrophied by this anti-Black carceral colonial apparatus. But it made me think of speciation. It made me think of speciation and how this might be one of the sites in which animality and the kind of end of anthropomorphism is kind of happening in real time, or maybe partially happening in real time. That's more of a share than a question. But yeah, you got me going on that. So Courtney, can I kick it over to you sharing the image? I'll share the images, and maybe you can think through them with Joshua.
Sure.
Cool? All right, so Josh, I'm going to share something with you here that Courtney brought to us as part of the preliminary discussion. It's really great. Okay, it's this thing right here. All right, go ahead, Courtney.
Oh, there we go. Yeah. So this is not to derail everything, but to zoo concepts, but I swear it's going to come around. This is from what I think is an emblematic book from 1914 by a writer named Ellen Velvin, who was very much in this vein of writing very positively about zoos, about adventure tales of animal traffickers, animal trainers. This woman with the lion here, and you were talking about the lion, is an animal trainer, and sort of the very much playing the part of the gentleman and lady animal trainer. So this writer very much makes this very common comparison between the jungle and the zoo, and how terrifying the jungle is, and how zoos are a positive good. So once you take them out of this horrible, and as she says in this quote, unhealthy place, their home, their habitat in Africa, and bring them to a nice cage, you know, tiled cage with bars in America, that this is so much better for them because they are safe. They don't have to go for their own food. They are at ease, and that this idea of using dogs as companion animals continues to today with these big cats, that this ultimate companion animal is also used to pacify big cats when they're in captivity. So this really, this made me think a lot about, you know, obviously this is reenacting a colonial attitude and justifying what you were talking about, how animal studies we'll talk about humaneness. And she thought that these people, like what we're seeing enacted here, was the ultimate in being humane towards animals by taking out of the big scary jungle. And zoos are places where you talk about how personhood is about the right to recognition and care. And zoos kind of enact that. They do sort of an ironic performance on that, because the recognition and care that the animals get is to justify the violence that is enacted on their habitats and on the inhabitants of their habitats. So all of which is to say, I think it ultimately, one way to look at it is it comes back to the land. This is making me wonder, when you talk about, let me make sure I get the phrase right. You talk about when we immerse ourselves, you were talking about the shark section, we immerse ourselves within this archive, this abyss archive, we find both otherworldly despair and fugitive possibilities. So possibilities towards relating to the land, having ecological thought at the end of the world, given the way we're enacting and performing this idea of land and humaneness and humanity, particularly from the way I'm looking at through zoos. I'm wondering, so much eco-criticism in America now is gesturing towards or referring to Native American relationships to the land and Native American artists, eco-critical artists. So I'm wondering, how do you think that these Native American relationships to the land can relate and intertwine with Black studies? And of course, sometimes those are very much the same thing, to get towards this other idea of ecological thought, because we are so used to seeing it presented to us in this ownership, property control way that you talk about so much in your book. That's a huge question, I know.
No, I mean, I think the global studies of how the global study of how various disparate traditions have related to the question of land and labor, I think is crucial. Not just for a kind of ecological criticism enterprise, but again, just to bring it back to Winter one more time, at least, this question of origin stories. Who are we? How have we historically understood these questions? And how are our contemporary understandings of these questions either keeping us from a kind of future we want, right? Or facilitating the creation of fugitive possibilities, right? Other, better, more loving ways of sharing the earth, right? If that's what we're after, then yeah, it's an all hands on deck situation, right? Like that's where we need to be looking to indigenous traditions, right? To Black and Asian diaspora. I mean, we need to be looking everywhere. Because yeah, there are these kind of dominant ideologies that we inherit through settler colonialism and our present stage of capitalism. But I think also there are these rays of light peeking through. I mean, there are always these other stories, right? And I think that's our job. That's my sense, at least increasingly. Like, our job is to amplify those stories as best we can. And this kind of practice about writing on the voice, it's just brought me back to that over and over and over again, right? Thinking about someone like Bessie Smith, and how Columbia Records tried to market songs that they didn't pay her for while she was alive, right? And her estate had to take them to court and say, oh yeah, you don't own her voice. You can't own a person. You can't own a person's voice. And the idea that you don't have to compensate her for circulating these recordings of her voice is absurd, right? But that was after she'd already passed away. It required someone else to take up that story and make that assertion on the behalf of an ancestor. I think that's the work that we all have to do. Okay.
That's brilliant. I know Mallory, you have a great question that you wanted to ask about Black study and about the new department. So maybe you can raise that here, and then we'll go into the clip that you wanted to share too.
Yeah, sure. So your comments about talking about the book together on the bus made me wonder whether you, but this is for both you, Joshua, and Dylan. Sorry.
Take your time.
whether you see ways in which the methodologies that you're using in the book, Joshua, the topics you approach, can be used, can act as part of the pedagogical or curricular framework for the new Department of Black Study that's coming up here at UCR. And what are some ways that you imagine this happening in a university setting like UCR?
Dylan, do you want to start? I can jump in. I have some stuff, but
Well, I mean, I can think about it in a particular, so I can answer that. I'll try to think about it in two ways, in a concise way. So one, I can think about it in the particular context of the emergence of the Department of Black Study here, which is foundationally Black trans studies, Black performance and queer studies. It's analytics of anti-Blackness, right? Kind of a centering in analytics of anti-Blackness. It's pushing back against African American studies, you know, with the capital A, capital A, capital S. Like, I think it's a profound challenge to African American studies. There's tons we'd have a whole seminar on that, actually. I think we probably should have a whole seminar on that.
I was gonna say, yeah, we should talk about that.
Yeah. So I mean, I'm saying that there's a tension there that at times the destructive one, which is not always bad. At times it's a productive one in the sense that you kind of find these tension points and you can think about what that means methodologically, pedagogically, curricularly, et cetera. So when I talk about African American studies with a capital A, capital A, capital S, I'm thinking about the kind of the most African American studies as a form of institutionality, right? There's a certain version of African American studies that's a kind of institutionality that other Black thought, Black praxis seems to be in periodic convergence and cooperation and collaboration with, and other times is in deep tension with. And this is why I think Black study here is so different. Why I'm so excited to be part of it is because of the centering of Black trans thought, Black performance, Black queer thought, Black abolitionist, specifically Black diasporic abolitionist traditions, as opposed to abolitionist, whatever that's come to mean, right? Which oftentimes gets alienated from the diasporic Black revolutionary tradition. And the analytics of anti-Blackness. So I think that this book accomplishes a lot for constructing a framework through which to think Black study, to think Black praxis. And for me, the way in which I enter the Department of Black Study in part is by constantly trying to work within, in affinity with, and frankly, honoring a Black revolutionary tradition of abolition. Which is necessarily embracing a politics and a creativity that is structured within destructivity, and that's precisely the thing that I think some of the circulations and appropriations and expropriations of abolition, right, in scare quotes, in recent years has avoided is the destructivity of it. I mean, you were talking earlier, Joshua. I know we're being recorded. We can always edit this, by the way. So
nice.
Just
all right, cool.
we can always edit this. But like, there's a violence to abolition that I feel responsible for taking ownership of this fact, right? There's a violence to abolition that I think many of us involved in abolitionist organizing movements and praxis for the last 25 plus years have strategically and tactically tried to avoid thinking and talking about it, because frankly, we anticipate that the kind of frameworks that we're trying to advocate or think about will get just rejected, right? Because people are kind of default pacifists. Anyways, I could go on and on, but Joshua, your turn.
Yeah, brother, it could ruin your life. Yeah, no, okay, so let's I mean, look, so I was trained in an Africana studies department, and I'm really but so you understand. So I mean, so look, for me, that was productive from a few different angles, right? One, we had a heavy emphasis on region, right? So my emphasis was in Latin America. So that meant I was taking classes on Brazil that were entirely in Portuguese for the most part. I mean, and that was just very productive. And I think it's probably why, now that I'm thinking back, why I started with this idea of Brooks's kind of the geographic power of Blackness and that Black people are everywhere, because that's a heavy emphasis in Africana studies, right? It's deeply historically rich, methodologically expansive, and you have to have a sense of how Blackness is lived in a bunch of different kind of geographical contexts, so that you're not pigeonholed to just thinking about the continental United States, etc. That was really, really important to me frankly, as a teenager, right? As a 17-year-old boy showing up on Penn's campus and thinking, oh, okay, like this is it's like Pilot Dead says in Morrison's Song of Solomon. She said, well, you say black, what do you mean by that? There's all different kinds of black, just like there's all different kinds of green. And she talks about like the green of a bottle, the green of a sky before a storm. And so when I think about models, I mean, we're trying to build a program and in Black Studies at MIT right now. And that's, brother, we could talk more about this maybe off call. But you have to work through a lot of this stuff, right? Because what you call the thing matters. And also when you look even just nationally at other models, there's a bunch of different ways that folks do it, right? The way they do it at UMass Amherst is very different from the way they do it, at Harvard, Yale, Princeton, except and the way they do it at Temple is different, right? If you look at the historical timeline, the way they do it at Cornell is different. And there are reasons for that, some of which have to do with individual academics, but others I think are really about folks trying to work out in real time, what is this meta-disciplinary historical project and what are we trying to contribute to life on planet Earth? And if nothing else, I appreciate that people have been taking those questions seriously for 50 years. To be honest with you, in our field, right? When I took this class, Sociology of W.E.B. Du Bois as an undergraduate, I mean, that I had a kind of reckoning with myself, like really thinking about Du Bois as a formative figure, not just in sociology, but in Black studies, the way he thought about the work of ethnography, the fact that he talked about Black studies as a contribution to science. I mean, that was radical to me, discovering that out of the first 10 Black PhDs in the United States, more than half of them were in the life sciences. I mean, that kind of stuff was fascinating because I realized, oh yeah, this is part of the Black radical tradition too, was actually saying we're not just making moral arguments against anti-Blackness, we're making certain kinds of cognitive arguments using the tools of scientific inquiry, right? And that this is a tradition Du Bois is pulling on and sometimes explicitly gesturing toward. So when you're talking about creating kind of new spaces for Black study, yeah, everything Dylan said, you got to lift that up. I think you have to lift up something I've been calling the Black scientific tradition, right? And you also have to think about the fact that universities exist in communities. Because I think, I learned a lot in the classroom when I was an undergrad. What I learned just as much from was being in Philly, right? Being around organizing communities in West Philadelphia that were anti-imperialist, right? That were abolitionist, that were deeply involved with the arts. Like, I think that was quite radical to me, just being around a lot of poets and musicians who were super well-read and highly eloquent, but eloquent in all sorts of ways. Like, I don't just mean the kind of like polish and social graces you get in an institution, but really people who just talk to different kinds of people a lot. So they were sharp off the cuff and they had citations and they were very serious and they weren't always nice. And what that meant was you had to learn to really struggle in community, right? Sometimes struggling with personality in community, that's one of the great lessons I learned as a teacher. It's like, yeah, everybody is not going to have the same comportment. Thank goodness. Why would you actually want that? Like, that's one of the many things we need to be pressing against at the level of institutionalization in the university, right? I got a call, we should edit this part out. I got a call from my kid's school a couple months back that told about him lounging. And I was like, don't call me about this. This is ridiculous. Like, they just literally meant he was relaxed. They were like, your son is too relaxed at school. And it just hit me. I was like, oh yeah, you're trying to kind of engineer his comportment at an early age, that in school he needs to sit up a certain way. I was like, is he disturbing class? Is he stealing from people? No, he's not. Don't call me about this again. Don't call me about lounging, right? But it brought me back to the ways that so many of us are schooled, right? We're schooled into a certain kind of carceral continuum, right? To understand ourselves as people who can and will be policed at any moment. So I think as we're talking about creating new programs and institutional sites for Black study, we always have to come back to those sites of Black study that existed far beyond the university, right? That Hortense Spillers writes about in her dissertation, for example, right? Like the preacher on the plantation, right? Like the people getting together in the belly of a ship to find ways to communicate, right? Thinking about long historical threads of Black studies and Black study and saying, what does it mean if we start there? If we start from that point, thinking about ancient ways of knowing and doing and taking that seriously for what that means for the future. Y'all got me all worked up. I'm talking about getting calls.
No, this is so good because what we're talking about is we're starting from a premise where we don't have to actually respond to the institutionalities of respectability and responsibility as a kind of premise that needs to be then displaced or dislodged, right? I mean, that's the whole point of it, because you've used the word wild and wildness more than once in this conversation so far, right? So it's like, it's about that. It's like, that's the starting point.
Yeah.
Insurgency is the starting point. Abolition is the starting point.
Right.
Meaning, and as a starting point, it's also a question, meaning that we don't presume a kind of canonical understanding of these things, or at our best anyways, at our best, we don't presume a canonical understanding of those things.
Yeah. And go ahead.
No.
And we don't presume certain teleologies, right? Like Black studies comes from the kids. It comes from quite literal student uprising and revolts on these campuses that also, again, looked all sorts of ways, right? So if you look at a place like Dartmouth, right? How did they get the El Hajj Malik El Shabazz Center on campus? Really think about that.
Yes.
Think about getting a building with that name built in the middle of the 20th century, right? At Dartmouth, right? In the woods in New Hampshire, right? Part of it was the threat of the kind of revolt that was happening on these other campuses across the country, right? Part of it too was where they had recruited from in Chicago, right? They had certain kind of cats on campus at that time, right? We're like, look, we'll take this thing over. This will look like Columbia or Cornell, right? If this don't fall a certain way. And I think that's really important that we remember it comes from youth uprising and revolt, our very discipline. That's a gift. That's not something to hide or tuck away. I think it is important to lead with that, right? To think about Black studies as beginning, at least on college campuses, in that way, and to say, yeah, that's our origin story. It comes from there. It's something to be proud of and to reflect upon.
Right on. Right. And by the way, just worth mentioning, based on in response to that question too, Mallory, is that for the record, Department of Black Study at UCR is a direct outcome of Black student and people in solidarity with Black students engaged in a set of militant demands on the university, one of which resulted in this process in which a bunch of my colleagues led the construction of this department. So so that's the genealogy, and but I'm saying that out loud because that's not always the point of origin. That's not always the origin story for departments of African American studies or Black studies or Africana studies, whatever. Oftentimes they're actually coming from a programmatic imperative or mandate from the university administration itself. This is not the case.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why my, my Zoom profile still says support the Department of Black Studies, because we actually still need grassroots and institutional support to become, to have an infrastructure. Right. And then again, that's a whole other set of problems and questions that unfold in front of us. I want to let Mallory continue by sharing this clip of this dance piece. So could you talk about it before I share the clip, or as I share the clip?
Thank you both so much for your responses to that question. Yes, anyway. So the question that kind of encompasses the clip I wanted to show departs a little bit from where Courtney and Amy both left off, asking about how can we apply your methodologies to think about the experiences of other groups of people of color. And my question asks, broadly speaking, how can we use your methodologies to think about other tropes that have been utilized to dehumanize Black folks? Thinking specifically about primitivism and savagery. This is a question we encounter in dance studies a lot. The submergence of the body below the mind, all that kind of thing. So I had recently been reading about this performance of Pina Bausch's Rite of Spring that occurred in Senegal during 2020. A collaboration with a school in Senegal with Pina Bausch's foundation, formed after she died, brought the choreography to this school, and this piece was rehearsed and performed by an all-Black African cast from like 14 different African countries. They weren't able to tour the piece in 2020 because of COVID, but they filmed their dress rehearsal, which took place on a beach in Senegal, just off the coast of an island where transatlantic slave ships were coming in and out of. So the Rite of Spring itself is an imagined past. It comes from Western and European dance traditions, and so they're imagining a white primitive past, in which the dance culminates in the sacrifice of a virgin girl. And so this piece, in setting it on an all-black cast, in filming it on this beach that was the site of so much historical violence, is doing something to, as you're saying, not push through concepts of animality, but push through concepts of primitivism to remind us where those concepts come from in the first place, and other kinds of violence besides this imagined, sort of romanticized human sacrifice thing that's happening, but into a real historical way of thinking about how we sacrificed people to the slave trade. Sorry if that was rambly.
Yeah, no, that's great. No, so Joshua, maybe we'll share we'll share a couple of minutes of the clip, and maybe you can just think about it with us in real time, and then Stella's gonna ask a question after that, possibly to close this out, unless folks in the audience want to bring anything up. So let me share this with you, and I got the sound on and everything, and hopefully folks on the stream can see this as well. Am I at the right spot? 35:29. Is that close enough?
Yeah, that works.
Okay. Tell me when to. Oh, am I gonna let it play through to the end?
Yeah, just
Okay.
about. It
Okay.
it ends with a couple of minutes
Perfect.
of credits, so we
Okay.
can pause when she jumps up.
Great. That provoke anything for you, Joshua?
Oh, a bunch. I mean, especially that ending. I don't know. I guess I'm always interested in the kind of interplay between performance and everyday life, and the fact that they don't stop recording after, the dance is complete, right? But rather move not only into applause, but these moments of social life that you sort of see, people hugging each other, people dapping one another up. I mean, at least kind of symbolically, right? It feels almost metonymic, like this idea that after we come through the great difficulty, violence, adversity, there's always the possibility of togetherness, right? And we bear witness as a collective, right? That even if you think you're going through it alone, you're never alone, right? There are those gathered around you. There's a kind of ensemble, and that ensemble is not just an ensemble of people to spectate, but actually to join and celebrate you, which is very much the spirit of the book. So it was cool to see that as well. Like that kind of combination feels true and good.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
So Stella's here, and Stella wanted to ask you a question. It's also she also posted it in the chat, but like why don't you go ahead and articulate the question, Stella?
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. I would like to know, like, countries as Brazil and US have been called people that are accused to involve in drugs traffic as mule. So I would like to know, what do you think about it related to what you wrote in your book, about what Spiller stated when she said, like, after slave ships, black body became flesh. So I would like to know, what do you think about this? When you call people mule, if you are dehumanization those people, in special when you connect with Spiller statement in her book as well.
Yeah. I think you mapped it out actually rather well in your questions. So let me see what I can add. I mean, I'm very much interested in the kind of vernacular resonances of the animal figures in the book. So mule's a really good example for a number of different reasons, right? So I opened that chapter through Patricia Hill Collins, for instance, talking about invisibilized labor, right? Now, there's actually many different ways to think about labor, in no small part because there are people who enjoy their labor, right? Labor is important to them. It's part of their social fabric or the way they understand themselves. And then there's this kind of exploitative, extractive labor, and we need to understand that distinction, especially when we're thinking about Black social life. When I talk about the mule in that chapter, it's explicitly through a lens of multiplicity, right? And Spiller's theorization of the Black body made flesh, which is a moment of what? Of commodification, in much the way that you're talking about, right? Trying to turn someone's body into an object, a commodity, a vehicle, right? A tractor, right? I mean, I think about this a great deal, not just in that mule chapter, but throughout the book, like the ways in which the language of enslavement is at every moment supposed to get us to engage in this hallucinatory performance where we pretend that these aren't flesh and blood human beings in front of us, right? To pretend that they don't have any interior life. My point about Douglas, his speaking engagements earlier is very much bound up in this, right? Phyllis Wheatley, the first reviews of her poetry. If she can write this way, how can she be enslaved, right?
That's right.
We were told these people had no interior lives. I'm here in Massachusetts right now. In the 18th century, there was something, that's been called the trial of Phyllis Wheatley, where legal scholars and local leaders were brought together for 2 days to assess whether this teenager could have actually produced a piece of literature, because they thought it had to be impossible, right? To me, that's inextricable from these forms of kind of animalization and commodification, right? This active kind of, unruly, not just dehumanization, but objectification. To say there's no way this is a person right in front of me, because how could we do this to people, right? How could we do this to their offspring and their ancestors? So no, that question is very much of a piece with something I've been thinking about a lot. I also am from Yonkers, New York. And so I grew up on DMX, and the way he talks about dogs has always been a part of my literary imagination, right? So he's interested in literal dogs as his friends, right? He says on this album, Grand Champ, that he trusts dogs more than he does humans, which I thought, that's a radical intervention. But also your human friends are also your dogs, right? And it's a point of praise, okay? So there, the animal metaphor, it's actually a heightening. It's not a lowering. Someone who's your dog is truer than a human friend because humans aren't as loyal as dogs are, right? So part of what I'm trying to capture in the book too are there are multiple valences when we think about Black vernacular culture and this relationship to animals. It doesn't always mark debasement or denigration. And that's really important for us to take seriously.
Yeah, that's such an important connection. Unless there's folks here that want to have the privilege of closing. Oh, okay, Maisha. Okay, thank you, Maisha.
Hey, Maisha.
Yeah, right. Maybe I'll close this out with this question.
Yeah.
I think it's a capacious enough question that it'll invite you just to offer us some, the conventional points of departure, closing thoughts kind of thing. But and I've shared this with you before. One of the reasons why I value your work so much, in this book in particular, is that it offers us both an example, but also a theorization of what we could name as a Black radical reading practice. So something beyond the methodology of close reading that I was talking about earlier, but it's a reading practice. over time, I've gotten to really appreciate how you take a reading practice really seriously and robustly in ways that draw from the various traditions, aesthetic, disciplinary, intellectual, and otherwise that you're in affinity and community with, right? So could you share with us a little bit about how you think through your reading practice, and especially how it's animated by this insurgency of Black being, of Black life, of Black making? I mean, the reading, you just reflected it back to us in your response to the clip that Mallory shared, right? Like that the first thing you jump to is the piece where Mallory's telling me to end the clip, right? She said, "Oh, it's over." But like the video kept going, right? Because they were standing. Mallory was saying they standing up yourself, dapping each other up. There's that moment. So like, there's something that you reflected back to us in your own reading practice. Just, I don't know. I think it's both intuitive, but it's more than that. I think there's something that's cultivated and nourished about this, probably pedagogically, with people who mentor you and teach you and stuff like that, and teach each other. But yeah, I just want to ask you to share with us how you think about reading practices.
Sure. And thank you again for making space for me here. I really appreciate it. Yeah, I mean, what I'm after in this book, and really all my books, is that I'm trying to help other folks look where we haven't been trained to look. So some of the most beautiful feedback I've gotten on this, especially that mule chapter, which Stella's question brought back to me, was, oh yeah, I read that scene 100 times of the mule funeral, and I've never thought about it that way, right? I've never thought about that as this moment where we're actually transported into the mule's world. That's what I'm after. Like, right, to look at these moments that you've actually been trained to think, oh, well, clearly, like that's a negative moment, or that's a moment of denigration. And I want to say, well, actually, I don't want to go too heavy on the etymology piece, but yeah, a denigration is a blackening, right? As Michael Awkward and others remind us, like at its very root. And there's something happening in the shadows and in the whispers of these texts that I want to pass down, because for me, frankly, it's part of what it means to be in what Michael Harper calls a continuum of consciousness, right? That's what I'm trying to transmit through the books, right? And this new book project I'm working on, I write about how in poetry and plays and science writing, throughout the 20th century, people are trying to pass down this thing called Black ecological consciousness, which is a sense that we're here to steward the earth, right? And that one of the many lies about white supremacy and anti-Blackness is that we have no relationship to the earth other than dominion or extraction, right? One of the many kinds of witness our people bears is fundamentally not true, right? And not just for the animals, for the air, the water, the trees, the flowers, they speak to us and they bear witness to the barbarity of these extractive, captive practices, right? And so we have to listen to them, right? They're our kin, they're our siblings, they're our ancestors too, right? They call out from beyond the grave, and they demand justice. And so my reading practice is all about that. It's also about unexpected adjacencies, right? So for me, yeah, if you pick up this book and you look at the, the footnotes, there's some, is Zora and Hayden, but there's some, there's Hegel in there, and there's some DMX in there, and my grandmother's in there, right? Because she was a sharecropper and she met my grandfather rather, in a field of strawberries, right? And when they would tell that story, they would talk about the redness of that field, right? That really stuck with me, because the idea was that the beauty and power of that first encounter could actually win out over whatever those people were trying to impose upon them in that town in North Carolina. Do you see what I'm saying? That was an incredible idea to me as a young person, that you could actually tell the story whatever way you want as it resonates, and that's scholarship. That's part of the literary tradition. And that part of the reason I'm here is actually to say, much like in our organizing work, right? It's like, oh yeah, we need to have surprising adjacencies, people who you wouldn't expect to be in the room together, collaborating and thinking about what world that we're planning to create together. And so that's how I try to think about my reading practice. It's how I think about teaching. I always want there to be dance, poetry, music, archival exploration. I'm trying to bring back field trips. I don't think field trips are just for little kids. It's key. Let's get on a big bus and go somewhere. As I met Dylan. So it's like, yeah, let's get on a big bus. let's go somewhere and let's explore. Because you're a person, and I really appreciate this. About Mallory's point, you're a person in a body, right? Like you have a body, you have a mind. And I believe in spirit, and you gotta electrify the whole thing, right? The practices of pedagogy that would try to propel us to separate one from the other, that's part of what we're here to fight too. We are a complete people. The tradition testifies to that. And I'm thankful for it every day. It's a great gift, but the point of a gift is to give it away. So that's
right.
what I'm trying to do in the writing.
Hey, so I lied. Liza's going to take us home. Speaking of Dartmouth, Liza's a Dartmouth grad.
Oh,
Sorry,
nice.
Dartmouth survivor, I should really say, right, Liza?
That's
I think
wild.
that's fair.
That's wild.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Yep, so my question is also in the chat. I noticed that in Being Property, you've referenced militancy and militating, which you used as a verb. And I was curious about what militancy and militating mean to you, and if you see a distinction between those terms.
I think it's a great way to close this out. Thanks for that question, Liza.
Yeah. I do. For me, at least in the book, militating for me is about a kind of it's a practice of how one organizes their mental states. Okay. So when I talk about militating in the book, I'm talking about how we militate against our own positions, which is very difficult to do. I find maybe it might be easier for other people gathered here. And so for me, militating is is how do you go to war with your consciousness, with everything you've been taught? How do you go to war with the image in the mirror, right? If you understand that at every stage of your life, you've just had a certain set of market design desires beamed at you at warp speed, how do you navigate that and eventually arrive at a position of something like Black is beautiful? I grew up with that language, but I've really been trying to think hard about what kind of militating against ideology that's internalized you have to go through to get there. So that's what I'm thinking about there, in part because I think that actually activates the righteous forms of militancy that we see in the material world, right? That for me, at least in my experience, begins as a certain kind of collective intellectual practice, right? That you read the literature, you sing the song. I'm big on music. I'm sorry. Like you sing the songs, you read the literature, you talk to one another. And that's part of how you actually gain the inner strength to engage in anything like an actual physical material struggle on the ground. We talk about self-defense. You got to believe you have a self to defend, right? You got to believe you have a community that's worth defending and people you love, right? And that doesn't need to be necessarily just blood ties, right? That's something that's established because you've been working on yourself, right? And that's a constant practice of transformation, right? And I really do believe that the inner transformation, it becomes exterior at some point, but through people power. So that's how I tend to think about it, at least.
Hey, thank you so much for this gift. I just want to say I love you. Hope you and your family are. So Joshua's a parent for the second time recently. So I want to extend this special gratitude for you for coming through. As you caretake the family. I trust everyone's healthy and as joyful as possible.